You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Welcome to HowStreet.com radio, the online source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is John Rubino, author of several books on the economy, including The Money Bubble. His website, dollarcollapse.com. Welcome to the show, John.
Hey, Jim. Good to talk to you again.
Well, Mr. Ben Bernanke, the former Fed chair, now in the pocket of private enterprise, he's telling us he feels that if China's economy tanks, it's no problem for the rest of us. Things will just march on. Well, will they?
Yeah, you know, the backstory to this is that Ben Bernanke has a history of downplaying the risks in the financial system that he is responsible for creating to an extent. And back in the mid-2000s, he was doing that with the housing bubble, saying, oh, there's no housing bubble, and even if subprime mortgages have a little bit of a hiccup, it's not going to affect the rest of the market. And he was, disastrously wrong, obviously. And so when he says something similar about China's credit bubble, you need to pay attention because he's a potentially really good negative indicator. And so, yeah, he just came out this week in response to some questions about all the debt that China has taken on and said, I don't see a hard landing, and they're making a normal transition from one kind of economy to another. But if you dig a little deeper, you see that China took on an astounding amount of debt in the last 10 years. They've taken on tens of trillions of dollars. They've accumulated debt more quickly than the U.S. has over that time. And their banking system now has more debt within it than the U.S. banking system does. And that's a lot of debt. And a lot of what China spent that money on turned out not to be a good idea. What economists would call malinvestment. They built entire cities that hardly anyone lives in now, and airports with very few planes flying in and out, and roads with hardly any traffic. Those things aren't generating the kind of cash flow necessary to pay off the related debt. So there are a lot of entities within China, local development authorities and private companies that are technically insolvent. And some of them are blowing up already, but most have not yet. So the Chinese government has to decide what to do, whether it's going to let the system flush out the bad debt, in which case it'll have a nasty recession but emerge healthier, or bail out everybody and follow the Japanese and the U.S. and the European template and risk a lost decade or two where they limp along, but they keep accumulating more and more debt and pushing the ultimate crisis out into the future. So anyhow, the fact that Ben Bernanke thinks they're fine probably indicates that we got a crisis coming in China. And so that's something we need to pay attention to, because in a crisis of the magnitude that the debt implies could be possible in China, in the second biggest economy in the world, will have ripple effects all over the world. This is bigger than anybody but the U.S. blowing up. And look what happened to us, or to the world, when we had our mortgage crisis followed by a derivatives crisis back in 2008, 2009. It almost took down the whole global financial system. So China, in short, could have a crisis very easily based on all the money they borrowed and the stupid way in which they've spent a lot of it, and it would have effects for the rest of the world. So should Ben Bernanke be wrong, and he usually is, we've got something serious coming our way.
Yes, you were pointing out you weren't very confident in his estimation of what would happen. Why wouldn't you be?
Well, he doesn't seem to understand the nature of credit crises. He was instrumental in blowing up the housing bubble in the U.S. in the middle of the last decade. And then as it started to blow up, he was the main talking head downplaying the risks. He was all the way into 2007, 2008 saying it didn't really matter and that the economy was going to grow and exports were going to increase and we'd get back to full employment in no time. And he was saying things like this right up until the global financial system was a few days away from martial law. and so clearly he had no idea what was going on back then. And the fact that he then flooded the system with cash, which is pretty much the easiest thing in the world to do. You just hit send, type in a number and hit send, and Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan Chase has a lot more money on its books to play with, and they do stuff with it, and it pulls at least the 1% out of a crisis, and stabilizes the economy, but at the cost of way more debt. And so he shouldn't have any credibility, and that he gets $250,000 per speech, et cetera, and is considered to be an economic expert, is something that historians are going to find curious, at least.
Wow, he gets more money per speech than Bill Clinton does. Bill's only $200,000 a speech.
Yeah.
And he's entertaining.
And he's taken a job with a hedge fund or a high-frequency trading fund. So he's making serious money. You know, he's cashing in, and as so many bureaucrats in the U.S. do. You know, their actual job in the government is really just an extended job interview for Wall Street. And once a regulator or a Fed governor or somebody is there for a few years and shows the big banks that they're capable of being a team player and putting the welfare of the banks above the welfare of taxpayers, they get to graduate to the serious money after they leave the government. And that appears to be what Ben Bernanke has done.
And of course, they still have all their inside contacts from where they worked, and they were the boss.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not like they're out there managing money now for some hedge fund. They're playing their contacts, basically. They're selling access, and so that's why they're worth so much money to these Wall Street banks. Not because they know anything about financial markets or how to manage money or how to structure deals or anything. It's because they can get somebody to pick up the phone in today's government. And that's a big deal for a bank who wants to invest money in re-election campaigns and reap some kind of a huge multiple of that investment in regulatory capture. In other words, getting laws changed to make the environment more favorable for Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan Chase, if it costs $1 million in campaign contributions and yields tens or hundreds of millions of dollars in operating profit, it's a really good deal. And so, to the extent that you have a guy working for you who can get you in the door to talk to the people making these laws and allow these quid pro quo deals to happen, they're worth a lot of money to you. So that's the dynamic that's at work, and that has been at work for a long time. They call it the Revolving Door, and it's one of the really serious dysfunctions in today's global financial system, that the big banks and the regulatory agencies and the legislative branch of the government are really all the same organization now. They're just different divisions in a profit-maximizing entity that basically doesn't care about taxpayers or much of anything else. It's just sucking wealth out of the private sector and into their pockets. And so while that's going on, nothing much else good gets done in Washington or anywhere else in the major financial capitals of the world.
Is that why voters are so cynical and don't bother to vote, because it doesn't matter who they elect, they're still in the pockets of the big banks?
It is indeed. Wall Street is the biggest contributor to both Republicans and Democrats in the U.S. And I don't know how that works in Canada, but I assume that the money flows both ways there as well. And while that's going on, you're never going to see any credible candidate, or you're going to see very few credible candidates, be willing to cross Wall Street, because that means they're at an immediate funding disadvantage versus a challenger who doesn't cross Wall Street and who gets millions of dollars with which to run commercials criticizing the incumbent, blah, 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 and it makes it really hard to win elections if somebody else is getting all Wall Street's money and you're not getting any of it. So very few candidates or politicians are confident enough to be able to go it alone without Wall Street money. And there are a few in the U.S. I mean, Ron Paul, obviously, has been doing it forever and getting reelected. And now that he's retired, though, there aren't very many left. Elizabeth Warren is a good example of somebody who is willing to stand up to the big banks and has gotten away with it so far. Bernie Sanders, who's now running for president against Hillary Clinton, and Rand Paul, to an extent, although he's more mainstream in the sense that he seems to be willing to compromise on some issues, which makes him more viable electorally than these other guys. But a little bit less interesting, a little bit less fun to listen to.
Canada has spending limits during the election, the official election campaign, which is, I think, some 60 days before you cast your ballot. But there's no rules about how much money they can spend before an election is called. And we're seeing a lot of ads, of course, saying your head guy is a bum. Pretty well.
Yeah. See, the thing is, there isn't an easy answer to campaign finance reform because money always finds a way. No matter what kind of a law you implement, there's going to be a loophole, and millions of dollars will flow through that loophole. And so money will still talk. And it's not clear what the ultimate solution is. The libertarian argument is that you should just allow the money to flow, but with complete disclosure. So in other words, if you're a candidate and you have tons of money, but it all came from the big banks, and I'm a candidate with very little money, but it's from mostly sources that are considered benign, like individual donations, things like that. Well, that gives me a campaign issue that I can use to bludgeon you with, if all of your money is transparent. If we can see where it all came from, and that might be the only solution that is workable, where we go ahead and let corporations and whoever spend as much as they need to spend to get their story out, but we all know what it is. We all see the money on websites, and so we can make a judgment about who is being funded by people that we approve of and who isn't. And we're nowhere near that yet, because in the U.S. a lot of this money is secret. And again, I don't know how it works in Canada, but here, you can be a billionaire, you can fund someone's election campaign via off-budget political action.
Donate office space or donate your corporate jet.
No, you can flat out donate money to certain types of political action committees here, and they're forbidden from designating who the donors are, from making that public. And so a lot of that goes on here. A lot of multimillionaires and billionaires pump huge amounts of money into our campaigns, and they do it more or less anonymously. And so, I'm not opposed to them spending money to promote ideas that they value, but we should know they're doing it, or if big tobacco or big oil or the pharmaceutical companies are pumping huge amounts of money into a given candidate, we should know that, and then we can make our own judgments. And I think in that case, money would lose a lot of its power, because the fact that we know where the money's coming from would be this huge negative that would offset the positive of the ability to run lots of campaign commercials. So,
But I can see a way around that would be for a big boss just to go around to the employees and say, I'm going to give each one of you $500, and if you know it's good for you, you'll contribute it to my favorite candidate. Yep.
Well, they do that now. It's called bundling.
Yeah.
Where a corporation or some other entity will take lots of little contributions, put them together into a big wad of cash and send it in, but that's the kind of thing where a whistleblower with a tape recorder can blow something like that out of the water. You just have that conversation with your boss, and then you post it on YouTube or something like that. So I think information would flow in those cases where it's coercive, where your job depends on you donating to a political entity that you don't necessarily believe in. So I don't know. Yeah, there's no really clean, perfect solution to any of this, because money is inherently corrupting. But it's also a form of free speech. You should be able to promote causes that you believe in, and you shouldn't be limited by the fact that you happen to have a little more money than the average person. So I don't know. I don't think there's a perfect answer to really any big issue. And there's only a series of compromises that get us as close as possible to the ideal, but we'll never get to perfection. That's not how human societies and human organizations work.
We'll have more with John Rubino right after this.
More and more people are looking to the internet for intelligent, riveting, and thought-provoking interviews. To advertise on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com, call 604-699-8600, 604-699-8600.
Welcome back. We're speaking with John Rubino, his website, dollarcollapse.com. Well, we were talking about Ben Bernanke saying it doesn't matter if China slows down. Are there any warning signs that the Chinese economy is about to come to a grinding halt?
Well, yeah, China's growth is slowing, and they're now looking at various kinds of stimulus measures like their version of QE and lower interest rates and other stuff to get it going again. And there's a huge question about whether you can do that in a world where the other countries aren't growing fast either. You know, who's going to buy a whole lot more Chinese exports? Is it going to be the U.S. or Europe or Japan? Probably not. In any case, you know, none of us are growing very fast, so it's going to be hard for China to reflate. And meanwhile, their stock market has just rocketed. It's doubled this year. This year so far, stocks are doubled in China. And something we're seeing there that's interesting is a lot of extreme high flyers, you know, multi-billion-dollar market cap companies are starting to crash. Week before last, 3 different companies all crashed almost instantaneously and lost a total of $40 billion. And that's a lot of market cap to evaporate, especially with just 3 companies, while the stock market in general is going up. So the question is, are they canaries in the coal mine? You know, are they a sign that the Chinese stock market has gotten way ahead of itself and that the economy doesn't justify the kinds of valuations that now apply to Chinese stocks? We won't know until after the fact. That's the kind of thing that happens when a bubble market begins to burst. But that's also the kind of thing that happens in the normal course of a bull market, where you get flash crashes in stocks. And so we won't know until we have some hindsight whether this is the turn in the Chinese market or not. But it's what the early part of the turn will look like when it finally comes. So it definitely bears watching. And, you know, as I said, China's not really growing. They've got all this malinvestment that they've got to work off. So they've got some very serious problems that can be measured by the amount of debt that they've taken on and the amount of money that they've created. You know, their central bank created more new currency in the last 5 years than the U.S. Fed and the Bank of Japan combined. And the U.S. Fed and the Bank of Japan had epic debt monetization programs during that time, where they created more money than any central banks have ever created in the past and pumped it into the banking system. Well, China did more than that, and they also borrowed more money than the U.S. and Japan combined in that time. You know, so these are gigantic numbers in a system that's never really been tested. You know, most of the institutions that China now has in place are pretty recent. They've been created in the last few decades, and they've never really been put to the test by a major financial crisis. So we really don't know what happens there. If some of their builders start to blow up and some local development agencies default on their debt, and et cetera, you know, the way a credit crisis happens and then spreads. We don't know how the Chinese institutions that are going to be tasked with fixing this problem, or at least stopping the bleeding, we don't know how they'll handle it. And so we will see, you know, when this debt starts to blow up, as it kind of sort of has to. You know, you can't take on this kind of debt and build out this kind of infrastructure and this kind of export capacity without there being some hiccups along the way. And this could be bigger than a typical hiccup, because the amount of debt they took on is gargantuan. So we'll see. You know, this is the kind of thing that you can speculate about in the short run, but China is so opaque and the numbers are so huge, and the details of where it all is and who owes what to whom and what kind of derivatives are involved, blah, blah, blah. You know, we just don't know that. And so we can't make any predictions. Not that you can really predict very easily what's going to happen in a modern economy anymore anyhow, because the world's central banks are playing such huge roles in the economy, whereas they didn't used to. So a lot of fundamental indicators don't matter anymore, because it's all about money creation at the central bank level flowing into various kinds of financial assets right now. So we can't really say anything with certainty. Can't make any short-term predictions. And all we can do is kind of ride along until this thing blows up, which it will in the not-too-distant future, one way or another. And so the real questions aren't whether this system ends in its current configuration, but the form of the ending. Is it a bond market collapse, or is it equities, or is it a currency crisis? There's no way to know, and it could be any of those things. And so we will see. I think the case can be made that sovereign debt is the epicenter of the next crisis, and the peripheral countries in the Eurozone and the weaker countries in the developing world who borrowed a lot of dollars, those are the guys who blow up first, and then it spreads to the rest of the world, with the U.S. maybe being the last in line, and so actually benefiting in the short run. Lots of terrified capital flowing into the U.S. and bidding up our equity prices, for instance. That's one scenario that could happen. You could see another leg in the U.S. equity bubble as the rest of the world sinks more and more deeply into crisis. So it's not a world that you would willingly choose to live in, I think, but it's one in which you could make some extra money by betting on capital flows towards the dollar, the U.S. dollar, and away from the euro in the year ahead.
And speaking of euro and the possibility that it might get a shot in the leg or in the heart even if Greece defaults, your question on your website was pretty interesting. Is Greece still a country if someone else owns all of their assets? Maybe explain that.
Yeah, the original, when Greece went functionally bankrupt a few years ago, the original solution proposed by the European creditors was for Greece to sell off a lot of its government-owned assets and use the proceeds to pay back the European Central Bank and the big European banks who had lent Greece a lot of money. And the Greeks didn't like that, among other parts of the policy that hurt the average voter in Greece. So they elected socialists who promised not to do any kind of privatization. And they held the line for a while, but it looks like the privatization program is starting to ramp up again. So the question becomes, when a country is selling off most of its productive assets to foreign multinational corporations mainly, at what point does the country stop being a country? If most of its best stuff is owned by German banks and Russian energy companies and American pharmaceutical companies, is that even a country anymore, or is it something else? And so we'll find out. Greece is going to be kind of a test case here to help us determine where the line is between a sovereign country and something that's basically a colony of multinational corporations. And another interesting angle here is that we're seeing, especially in the U.S., the same process work out on a different scale, where individuals and families are being tricked, basically, into borrowing huge amounts of money for student loans and car loans and credit card debt and mortgages, and are basically being turned into debt slaves or serfs of the big banks, where they spend the rest of their lives, in effect, trying to pay back these loans that they never should have taken out in the first place, and can barely cover, but really have no choice. Especially the student loans in the U.S., you can't get rid of them by going bankrupt. So you're stuck with them for life under current law. And we're going deeply into subprime auto lending now, which is kind of an amazing thing to be a growth industry. We're lending money, long-term money, on cars to people who probably shouldn't be borrowing anything for a car in the first place. Instead, we're locking them into 6 and 7 year loans, and so they're stuck for a really long time paying off money that's related to a depreciating asset. It's not like a mortgage on a house where maybe the house is worth more later, so when you pay it off, you still have a form of savings in a chunk of real estate. Well, with a car, by the time you're done paying off your loan, 7 years from now, what's a 7-year-old car worth as a percent of its original cost? 10% or something like that, some ridiculously small number. And so you lost coming and going by buying a new car here, and the big banks won. So we're kind of doing that to families here in the U.S. while we're doing it to developing countries like Greece and to a lot of other countries that the global financial system is able to convince to borrow huge amounts of money and then to profit from those countries' defaults or near defaults or restructurings or whatever they end up doing, or privatization programs. So it's a disturbing process at work on a lot of different levels around the world. And Greece is the headline player right now, but let Greece be solved to the satisfaction of the big banks and the other multinationals, and then look out Italy and Portugal and Spain. They're going to be in the same boat, needing some kind of a bailout and having to take steps that transfer power from local voters to distant multinationals. So unless something politically happens in the next 6 months or a couple of years, we'll see this process play out, where Greece is the template and it gets applied to a lot of other countries.
Is that why governments are stocking up on bullets right now? When all those young unemployed adults realize there is no hope, there might be a few riots?
Yeah, I think there might be. And I think that when you borrow a lot of money at a national or international level, you increase the odds of a financial crisis that leads to some kind of civil unrest or political crisis or whatever. So from the point of view of a country that's borrowing way too much money and impoverishing its citizens in other ways, stocking up on bullets is just basic prudence. You know, there might not even be a specific plan in mind. It's just that they want to be ready if everything blows up. You know, when it hits the fan, they want to be armed and militarized and ready to go. So it's not a surprise that anybody with a sense of history would want to be prepared for some kind of a crisis when they're borrowing the kind of money that we're borrowing around the world right now. So, yeah.
And the government's keeping track of who might lead that revolution, too, because of all their new anti-terrorism laws that no one has demonstrated any need for them or could prove that things weren't caught because we didn't have them. They're doing it simply because they want to spy on you and your bank account and find out who's not happy.
Yeah, it's all part of a package. And, you know, every piece of the package has a reasonable justification in and of itself. You know, in a vacuum, it's reasonable for the government to do its best to prevent another 9/11. Okay, that's undeniable, and we should have people out there actively trying to stop crazies with weapons of mass destruction. However, and we should have governments that are able to provide a little bit of a safety net and defend us overseas and all that. You know, but when you add up the cost of everything and the limits on individual freedom that derive from a lot of these things, you're creating what a lot of people now call a turnkey totalitarian system, where we've got all of these different pieces in place, where the government is monitoring our finances and our communication, and the local police have been militarized to the point where they're more like an occupying army in a lot of cases, at least to look at them. You know, they've got these armored troop carriers, and in some cases actual tanks, and they've got those, you know, black helmets and high-powered rifles and all the rest. And so we've got all the pieces in place for a very different kind of government. And if there's another terrorist attack or some kind of natural disaster or some kind of financial crisis, we'll see all the pieces be knitted together into, I mean, if they do it right, if they do it the way they want to do it, it looks like, into a coherent, really authoritarian government. And because it happened kind of piecemeal, it'll surprise the average person. But if you look at each individual piece, you see that they all do kind of tie together. And if they're coordinated well, that's a big if. You know, it's not clear that governments are efficient enough to pull this off and combine all these technologies into a coherent system. But if they can do it, they've got Big Brother, you know? They've got something out of a dystopian novel that is put together and ready to go. And we just have to hope that we don't have the kind of crisis that leads some kind of, desperate government somewhere in the world or at a multinational level to want to flip that switch and turn it on.
Well, as they say, may you live in interesting times.
Yeah, these are indeed interesting times, Jim.
John, thanks a lot for chatting with us.
Sure, anytime.
My guest has been John Rubino, author of several books on the economy, including The Money Bubble, his website, dollarcollapse.com. You're listening to HowStreet.com radio. Find us on Twitter at Talk Digital Net. Check out our popular YouTube channel, Talk Digital Network. Comments about the show can be sent to info@HowStreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard.
Comments made on HowStreet.com radio are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. HowStreet.com radio is a production of HowStreet Media Incorporated.